Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the El Diviso Natural Processed Colombia from H&S Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And H&S, based out of Laramie, Wyoming. And this coffee was featured in a blind taste test rankings video earlier this year, where it finished 5th place out of 5 H&S coffees on that day. Unlike a lot of other people, this coffee immediately caught my interest due to the listed gochujang note. Fun fact about that, Korean cuisine is actually my favorite style of cuisine, but I wasn't overly sure how that might translate into a cup of coffee. In addition to that, natural processed Colombian coffees are probably my least favorite processing origin combination out there, so it's always going to be interesting to see how this coffee turned out for me, as this right here is day 72. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I actually like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. So even though I oftentimes say that it can be a little bit more tricky to tell when it comes to slightly more processed coffees, this one being an ultralight definitely shone through, as you could certainly tell that this one had a lot of lightness to it, given that it seemed to perform in a very clean and clear light sense to it. So I would say that this one once again is on the very, very light side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 16, first impression, and that was that blind taste test day. And the coffee itself is interesting, as the whole beans offer a slight hot sauce-like aroma, while the grind and bloom does yield a very strong red berry natural Colombian-like aroma. The natural Colombian aroma does translate into the cup slightly less, in a slightly less heavy sense, but it does leave a very lingering spiced tone in the finish, and that's kind of the impression I had of this coffee. So if you watched that blind taste test, you saw that I was able to pick up that cup of coffee, and I took in the aroma, and I immediately knew that it was a natural. So I waited to drink this coffee until last, but then when I actually drank the coffee, I said, okay, it's not as overbearing and heavy as I might have expected, given that it is a natural processed Colombian coffee. So I kind of took away a very mixed first impression, as it wasn't quite as bad as I was necessarily expecting. Let it rest for a bit, and we revisit it on day 33 as we opted for the Chemex, and the intensity has improved with rest, as it has resulted in a stronger red fruit Colombian base with a much more pronounced red pepper tone to it. Initially, it was slightly toned down, but it is now reminiscent of what I would describe as being hot tamales, as it does have a candied characteristic, and that hot tamales theme is going to be a bit of a recurring theme throughout this review, as it's one of the more prominent notes that I was experiencing within this coffee, but we're going to kind of expand upon that going forward, as on day 36, we opted for the April brewer, and the coffee is a little better as there's not as much intensity in that peppered sense. Additionally, it is slightly reminiscent of what I describe as racleta, which is of course those Mexican lollipops, as it has the candied aspect to it, with it being heavily focused on the red tones. However, it does leave a slightly lingering spiced tone in the finish, yet again, a little bit more reminiscent of that cayenne pepper that usually is accompanied on that lollipop. We move on to day 39 as we opted for the V60 with the higher extraction adjustment. So of course, a more fine grind, a lower concentration, and in addition to that, a higher brew temperature. And interestingly, it helps tone down some of the peppered intensity, as it's a bit more reminiscent of cayenne pepper without the same level of intensity as some of the earlier days. So mixed impressions, as it didn't really seem to offer a whole lot more outside of that. Day 42, through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it does feel like the overall pepper tone to this coffee has been toned down, as it's kind of hard getting back to the intensity of the aroma, with it not translating as predominantly within the cup, rather opting for a much cleaner strawberry candied sweetness contrasted by that slight spice quality. And that's one of the main reasons I stuck with the Chemex, is that it didn't quite translate as heavily into the Chemex as it did in other brew methods. So for that reason, I kept revisiting that one as our main go-to. Day 45, back through the V60 with the higher extraction adjustments, and the coffee just feels like it's intensifying with the strong red lollipop characteristic, being a bit more prominent this time around in a much more fermenty processed Colombian sense, but without the heaviness. And that's what's so interesting about this coffee, is yes, it's a natural processed Colombian coffee, and the main reason I don't like them is because they're just so overbearing and so heavy. But this coffee was not in any regard. It came out, interestingly, just a bit cleaner overall, and I do attribute that to the ultralight profile of this coffee. It does leave a very long-lasting spice tone in the aftertaste now. Day 48 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and there's a notable difference with the brew methods, as this one does come out a bit cleaner with less of the spiced qualities, as it does continue to focus a bit more on the candied strawberry, and we replicated that experience on day 51, as it was also pretty similar, not too much dad in terms of those notes, as that really did seem to help kind of tone down a lot of those qualities, and it provided a level of consistency with this coffee as well. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 4 level 5s, so let's go through those. We will start with the finish at a level 5. So yeah, this one has a very, very long-lasting pepper finish to it. A lot of that hot tamales, however you want to describe it, cayenne pepper, just a lot of that red tone to it that seems to linger for an extended period of time in this one. And I mean, depending on how you feel about it, it wasn't necessarily my favorite quality of this coffee, and it just seemed to last for a very long period of time. So make of that what you will. Let's just go ahead and move on. Spice, level 5. If there's ever a coffee that justified the spice being at a level 5, it is this coffee, because I always say when that spice quality is there, it's not necessarily that the coffee is spicy, but rather that it's offering some spiced qualities to it, whether it be something like a cinnamon or a nutmeg. But in this case, no, this one's actually spicy, and I didn't think that we would actually ever use that for spicy coffee. And I can't imagine anything being reminiscent of something like this, as this is about as justifiable of a level 5 as we've said for any coffee on any category ever. So yeah, given that there's those very strong pepper tones to this one, level 5 does seem to fit. Berry fruit, level 5. I said going into this one that natural processed Colombian coffees were probably my least favorite coffees, mostly because they do have that very strong, overly heavy red berry fruit to them. This one interestingly presented itself in a cleaner strawberry lollipop-like sense, so it wasn't heavy and overbearing. But given that this coffee was weirdly clean at the base of it, like it was weirdly soft, a lot of the components in this one that were present in it were very pronounced as a result and very well defined, as was the berry fruit quality in this one. So yeah, it's scoring all the way up there at that level 5. Savoriness, level 5. I think that one is also self-explanatory in the same way that the spiced quality was, as it does seem to offer so many of those just slightly more savory peppered qualities to this one. So yeah, quite a few level 5s. Let's just go ahead and move on. We'll start with the sweetness, level 4. This coffee was weirdly sweet, and I continued to mention that a lot of that was the candied aspects. And what I've heard from people regarding this coffee is that there's a surprisingly nice sweetness that's buried underneath this very interesting, strong peppered tone to this one. And that's something that I definitely felt as one of the earlier takeaways I had of this coffee is it seems to be very clean in a very candied sense. So that's the best takeaway I do have. I know that they have a strawberry note listed on here. I can't recall whether or not it was candied in any sense. Acidity, level 4, it was also weirdly bright, as it's something that I've continued to mention, but I think where that comes into play is that usually natural processed Colombian coffees also tend to be a bit out of whack in the overall brightness. Like they tend to be a little bit unbalanced and oftentimes skew in the overbearing sense for acidity as well. And that's usually where I end up scoring a lot of coffees at that level 5 for acidity, but this one right here was a bit balanced in that sense. So level 4 is where I opted to put it. We'll skim through here real quick. Level 3, caramel. That's exclusively the candied sweetness, as I continue to harp on the fact that a lot of the strawberry components in this one were very candied and definitely the best part of this coffee for me. Body, level 2. Once again, this one was lighter bodied, and I think that the Chemex might have been at play with the overall result of that, but even then I wouldn't necessarily say that this coffee was probably ever intended to be the most textured. And then the final thing and most important thing worth discussing, the cleanliness at the level 3. I think that they have the funk level on this one somewhere at that level 3 mark at the very least. And once again, it's tricky because yes, it's not clean in the traditional sense, mostly because a lot of the flavors that are presented in this one do tend to skew in a much less clean direction. But like I've said with some coffees in the past, how do you really chart something like this given that the profile in it is very defined? Like the base of this coffee is surprisingly clean. There aren't the normal things I can take away from it because it's not really boozy, fermenty. It is slightly, and that's why it's marked down ever so slightly from that level 4. But even outside of that, the profile of this coffee is just so defined, and it's lacking any of the undesirable characteristics in terms of that funkiness, fermentiness that would usually take away from it. So level 3 is where I opted to put it, and it's probably the best place for it. And as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. In hindsight, as I'm kind of thinking back on it, I probably should have really leaned into what this coffee was, because that's usually the case. If I'm not enjoying a coffee whatsoever, then I usually like to just skew it in the direction that I feel like it's intended to go. And this coffee had so much potential to go in a very undesirable direction, but I actually worked through this coffee to a point where it was much more palatable and enjoyable, to the point where I was actually able to get through this review. That being said, I'll be completely honest. Vast majority of the time that I was brewing this coffee, I did not finish any of the cups of coffee, mostly because it was just so difficult to get through the very unusual flavor profile that was presented in it. That being said, as far as natural processed Colombian coffees go, I've had much worse than this one. So that's all to say that this coffee is fine, and it did exactly what it was intended to do. Sorry about that. It did exactly what it was intended to do, which was offer a very unique, different, and out there experience. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like if you really like your strong red pepper aspects, then this one's a very good fit for you. It's presented in a very light and clean sense, and allows you to really experience a lot of these qualities, while at the same time not being too overbearing, which is kind of unique in that you fully expect this coffee to skew in that direction. Probably the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the El Diviso Natural Processed Colombia from H&S Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.